Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. One failed astronaut will speak to you this morning about. I'll start and say a few words about my personal experiences on the road to space, and then Charlie Walker is going to say a few words about the National Space Society and the future of the road to space. And after that, we'll leave some time for some discussion and questions from the floor. I put this slide in for purposes of focusing. It's a letter from Kepler to Galileo on the 19th of April, 1610. It was after Kepler had done his important work on the motions of Mars, having got a hold of Tycho Brahe's data. It illustrates rather nicely a few things. One, of course, is the international nature of science, because Kepler was a German working in Czechoslovakia with the Danish Dr. Brahe, Tycho Brahe, and he was writing his letter to an Italian, Galileo. And what it says, in case you don't read French, it says it would be sufficient to construct a vessel or sails adapted to the heavens, and certain people would not be afraid to leave even into this empty void of space.
Yeah, 50-footer.
So, for those who would certainly come to attempt this voyage, let us establish the astronomical plan. You, Galileo, that plan for Jupiter, and me for the moon. Now, that was in 1610, and Johannes Kepler forecasted manned spaceflight and seriously considered it at that time. These guys were, of course, okay. We're going to back to Kepler, realizing that Kepler would immediately surpass Brahe in reputation and accomplishment as soon as he got the record. So these are, if you could refocus that, it would be helpful too. Kepler was another one. He was born a premature birth in Württemberg in Germany in 1557, and he was quite spectacularly short. It's politically incorrect these days to say short. You're supposed to say vertically challenged. But anyway, Kepler was quite remarkably short. And he was spectacularly ugly. You're not supposed to say ugly either. It's aesthetically challenged. But anyway. Kepler was also poor. And the only reason he got an education was that the Dukes of Württemberg, back in the 1500s, had an enlightened policy of providing scholarships for the bright children of their vassals. And so, thanks to that enlightened, and we might even think modern policy, Kepler became an astronomer. And he was the first to put aside the assumption that everything moves in perfect circles in the heavens. Having put aside that assumption, he was able to fit different mathematical models, or attempt to fit Brahe's data to mathematical models. And that was his approach. When he came to fitting the motions of Mars, assumed to be about the sun, into the model of the ellipse, he got a perfect fit. And then he knew he had reality. And he published that about 1608. It took him about 6 years to do that. Well, now that we have the slide projector there, I'll get on with my talk. And in giving a talk of this kind, it's usually better to just leap right into it and not give any preliminaries or delay. But I do want to pause just for an instant in order to consider briefly what might be lying beneath the surface. And beneath the surface, of course, we usually think that astronaut adventures. I want to tell you about 3 adventures. I will give these personal experiences, and then Charlie will come along with the future. We usually think of astronaut adventures getting onto a spacecraft, excuse me, and blasting off into space. But in fact, it hardly ever happens, and most of the time we spend in training in simulators such as this. As a matter of fact, in the Canadian astronaut program, You get to spend 1 week in space every 10 years if you are lucky, and that's less than 1/5 of 1% of the time. In fact, astronauts rarely fly in space. Most of the time it's training, sometimes real fun training. And NASA's T-38, this was a two-plane formation. I was able to photograph the other aircraft, and even came across a beautiful rainbow over the Gulf of Mexico. Sometimes upside down above the clouds. It's a wonderful experience. Sometimes I would fly more modest aircraft. They were always aerobatic aircraft. I see Bruce Aikenhead in the audience. He kindly supplied cash for me to fly in this aircraft. On many occasions, I think he was a little uncomfortable, but he did keep me familiar with the aerospace environment during my training, which I thought was very forward-looking and proud of it. Sometimes you are exposed to sudden weight loss. And here I lost all my weight. And you learn, in fact, that you could do in weightlessness almost anything that you could do under 1G. You could go for a float with your favorite colleague, and you could push off the wall and fly like Superman. Just a fabulous, almost transcendental experience. Hard to describe it. It's as if you were sitting there 1 foot above your chair in the air and really didn't know how to get back down again. It's a fabulous sort of experience. But a lot of the training involved emergencies during launch and re-entry. We had to learn, for example, how to come down a rope slowly, propelling down a rope, which is necessary because if the shuttle landed in the woods somewhere, all the exits are very high, and if you're going to get out at all, you had to come down the rope. So a lot of time was spent with emergencies. A lot of time was spent also talking with a lot of interesting people. Astronauts spend a lot of time talking. It's very interesting, quite fascinating to meet celebrities. For example, I once had the pleasure of having dinner at the house of Vice President Dan Quayle. And the night before that, we had a big banquet. And I kept the menu from that banquet just in case the Vice President made a remark about my name. And sure enough, when I met him, he said, "Well, Dr. Money," he said, "you must get a lot of remarks about your name." So I took the menu out of my pocket and I said, "Yes, I do," which is why I was so delighted to see what we were having for dinner last night. We had stuffed quail. I was the only one all night to get a real laugh out of him. And in fact, I find with celebrities in general that they're quite bored with people who are half scared of them and overly polite and they like a smart ass now and then. Well, a lot of our time, of course, is spent learning science in laboratories and also in libraries and by reading. And it was by reading that I came across these wonderful NASA photographs, which in a way are among the most important and most inspiring of NASA's products. You've no doubt seen this wonderful photograph of planet Earth taken by an Apollo astronaut on his way home from the moon. But you might not have seen this series of photographs of the moon, of planet Earth rising above the horizon of the moon. And this photograph is my favorite of all photographs of anything. It has a name, it's called Earthrise. And when President Lyndon Johnson first saw this photograph, he remarked, "That is a wonderful photograph," he said, and he turned to his secretary and he said, "I want you to send a copy of that photograph to every head of state in the world with my compliments." And his secretary was an obedient soul and did exactly that. And 2 months later, Lyndon Johnson received in the mail a handwritten letter of thanks from Ho Chi Minh, even though the Vietnam War was still raging at the time. And he was very proud of that letter, carried it around his pocket for more than 2 weeks, and showed it to everyone he met during that period of time. And it was perhaps not the first time in history that we stopped our games of conflict between groups, which is what I call a war. I think it's the same phenomenon as we see in conflict between races and between countries and between cultures and whatever. We have a taste for and an enthusiasm for great conflict. But sometimes we can stop to be civilized. And this has happened before, most notably by the ancient Greeks, who were constantly at war. There are various city-states in Greece who were always at war. But they would actually stop their wars for a week every 4 years in order to hold the Olympic Games. And the Olympic Games, you might have recalled from the opening ceremonies, they release a bunch of pigeons during the opening ceremonies. And this is in fact to recall the time in Greek history when the soldiers, the best athletes from the armies, would come together for the Olympic Games, and they would bring with them homing pigeons. And when the games actually started, they released the homing pigeons, which would take back to the fields that were warring the word that the games had actually started. And then the armies would actually put down their weapons and stop fighting for 1 week. Phenomenal thing, when you think of it. And this is one of my pet projects now. I'm trying to convince the International Olympic Committee to restore this tradition, to reserve the Olympic Games for people who are at peace, and tell everyone you should stop your war for 1 week every 4 years in order to have these games. And if you won't do that, then you can't come to our games. And you might think that's impossible, but it was done before. The Greeks did it. They actually stopped their wars for 1 week. And I think this is a wonderful expression of human rationality, and that we can reinstitute this if we have the will to do so. Well, also, and I'm starting now into my intellectual adventure, this is the photograph that launched me on the adventure. I wanted to find out, this is of course the surface of the moon. It's full of impact craters, just covered. You only look at the surface of the moon to know that we live in a shooting gallery. And I wanted to know how come planet Earth doesn't get more of these, since the moon is covered with them. And into the library, and I very quickly found out that there are several obvious reasons, and one is that most of the meteoroids are rather small, and they burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. The moon doesn't have an atmosphere. And of course, those that do reach the surface of planet Earth, 70% are swallowed up by water, and of the rest that do make an impact on dry land, they are erased over time by raining and freezing and thawing, movement of tectonic plates, volcanism, and so on. Accordingly, I looked for and found some of the remains on planet Earth. And this one, of course, is in northern Canada. It's Lac Manicouagan, and it's 60 kilometers across that circle. Also, this is Wolf Creek in Australia. It's about 0.8 kilometers across. It's 300,000 years old. And it lasted like that, an obvious-looking crater, for that length of time, because it's very dry there. There's no freezing, thawing, raining, or whatever. And so it was maintained. And this is the meteorite crater near Flagstaff, Arizona, 30,000 years old. And it's available for people to go and see and to study. And of course, there is the one that hit in the Yucatan Peninsula, the Chicxulub body, which is actually now under the surface, under the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, partly, and partly under the Mexican Yucatan. And this one is actually now known to be 300 kilometers across. It landed 65 million years ago. And although it was only approximately, thought to be approximately 10 kilometers in diameter when it arrived, it came at super high speed and broke right through the crust of the Earth and splashed enormous volumes of dust and debris into the atmosphere and into outer space. And this dust and debris formed a pretty good shield against the sun, thereby killing off essentially all surface vegetation on dry land. And as a result of that, every animal that was bigger than about 70 kilograms died. And it was at this occasion in all probability, it is now thought, that the dinosaurs disappeared, and as a result of that, the mammals became more dominant on planet Earth, mammals such as ourselves. And if it wasn't for that impact, we would not be here. It changed the whole course of history on planet Earth, including ours, and it's fair to say that we wouldn't be here if that meteorite had not hit 65 million years ago. So that was my intellectual adventure as far as the impacts on Earth. But then, of course, it occurred to me to wonder, where did these bodies come from, these meteorites, and where did the planet Earth come from, and where did the stars come from? And eventually I got back to the ultimate question, what was the beginning? And I'm happy to report that the final question is, what is the evidence for the Big Bang? And I came across, first of all, there's a pretty good consensus among astronomers and interested physicists that the Big Bang is a real historical event. And so I found, first of all, among the 4 different kinds of evidence, the universe has expanded. This was shown by Hubble. Hubble Space Telescope was named after Edwin Hubble, whose major contribution was to show that the universe is expanding. That's the evidence. The argument is, well, if it was expanding, if you take that backwards in time, it all started in one place. And the beginning of the expansion is called the Big Bang. The second kind of evidence, of course, is that if such an enormous explosion took place, the only thing that would have survived it would be hydrogen and helium, about 75% hydrogen, 25% helium. So it's the proportions of the chemical elements that formed after that from hydrogen and helium by nuclear reactions in stars, the only source of heavier atoms. And it's the proportions of the chemical elements in the universe which is the second major piece of evidence that the Big Bang really occurred. That's the evidence, the proportions of the elements that it's found. And the argument is, these are the proportions that a Big Bang would have produced over time, and therefore the Big Bang did happen in order to produce them. The third kind of evidence is the cosmic background radiation, which was, of course, the major objective of the COBE satellite shown here, which was launched in 1989 by NASA. And the COBE satellite found the leftover radiation from the Big Bang. That's why they sent it up. The mission was extravagantly successful and positive, and to most people established that the leftover radiation from the Big Bang was present in all the spectrum that was predicted, including the lumpiness that would be required of an earlier universe to produce the present universe over time. That's the evidence. The radiation is there. The argument, of course, is, well, if the radiation is there, the Big Bang must have happened in order to produce that radiation. And the fourth kind of evidence I came across was that we have telescopes that could see beyond 15 billion light years. They could see quasars there if any were present. But when we look beyond 15 billion light years, we see nothing. No quasars. That's the evidence. The argument is, well, if there are, in fact, no objects beyond 15 billion light years, therefore there was a beginning about 15 billion years ago, and we'll call it the beginning of the Big Bang. So those are the 4 kinds of evidence, and it convinced me that in all probability, the Big Bang really happened. And that was my intellectual adventure. Now this represents my physical adventure. I must say that, especially now that I have Bruce Aiken at my mercy, he's not allowed to speak in my campus. My former boss is sitting in the audience, and we'll say that Bruce Aiken had instructed his astronauts to go out and get qualified in skydiving. He said make it an exercise in stress management. Most bosses try to reduce the stress on their guys as much as possible. He wanted us to deliberately seek out and experience stress. And so we did. We didn't tell him that, in fact, after the first 3 jumps, it was no longer stressful. It was sheer pleasure. But nevertheless, this is what it was. Now, the adventure I want to tell you about started in Houston on a Saturday, and I went into a badminton tournament. I'm a keen badminton player. I like to think I'm the best old man badminton player in North America. I went into this tournament. It wasn't a no-man's tournament, unfortunately, but I did get lucky and stayed in the running all day. Only got beat out in the semi-final by a 20-year-old hammer. And as a result of that, though, I picked up tennis elbow. Not a big deal. It only affects me when I do a backhand. And when I do a backhand, it really hurts to get a tennis elbow. But if you don't, you're entirely normal. There's no pain, no nothing. So I made my plans for what I would do about that. I would not play badminton for 2 weeks. I would play carefully for the following 3 weeks, and then it would be gone, as happened before. That was Saturday. Sunday, I went skydiving, giving it not a thought. Went up to 13,000 feet, parachute on, of course, and leaped out with gay abandon, docked to my instructor, threw a couple of back somersaults, checking my altimeter every 5 or 10 seconds as you're supposed to, and 5,000 feet, because I'm a relative beginner, moved away from the others in the stick and waved off and did the drill for pulling the ripcord, which is look, reach, pull, check, and checking the parachute. Of course, I went look, reach, couldn't pull. It's my bad luck to have a hard pull at the same time as I had tennis elbow. My tennis elbow wouldn't let me pull. Not to save my life, but I pulled. So I thought, well, you're a clever chap, and you have another hand. So I switched hands and pulled with my other hand. But switching, for some reason, got me spinning like a figure skater. And you're not supposed to pull while spinning. You're supposed to pull while skating. But the first priority, of course, is to pull. Especially since I got rid of my automatic opening device, because eventually most jumpers do get rid of it. You're afraid that it might pull when you don't want it to, and do you in because of that. Anyhow, as the parachute cap came out and I was spinning, every time I went around to get a look at it, it was rotating in the direction opposite to me. Of course, as the cords came out, they were all getting wrapped up. And when the parachute appeared, it was all pulled in on the edges. It was a rectangular chute, of course. Very, very small parachute, not enough to prevent death. And I continued to spin under it, and the wrap and the lines came down, would have grabbed me by the neck, except I ducked my head, and it ground to a halt in the back of my neck, forcing my face into my altimeter. It said 4,000 feet. So I immediately thought, well, my limit is 2,000 feet. And if I don't have a perfect parachute by 2,000 feet, that is when I'm going to cut away this thing and use my reserve parachute. But then I started to unwind. So I made me as small as possible so I'd unwind faster. And having done that, I'd done everything I could. All I had to do then was wait for 2,000 feet or a perfect parachute, whichever comes first. And it's funny what you think of while waiting for 2,000 feet. What I thought was, you could be the first guy in the world to die of tennis elbow. And then I thought, but you never told anybody you had tennis elbow. They'll just think you fouled up, you know. There you are. But just a little bit below 2,000 feet, I unwound completely and perfect parachute. No trouble at all. So I landed that one, repacked the parachute, and went up. And would you believe the very next jump? I tried what is called tracking, where you put your hands down near your waist, your head comes down, and you can move like an airplane, translate over the ground about a mile or so while falling 2 miles. And you know, it's great fun. I'm an airplane, whee! But your speed goes up from the usual 120 to about 200. And when the speed went up, it blew off my goggles and lifted them up briefly and blew off a contact lens. And I didn't know I lost that because my eyes felt funny while they had a good blast of wind, so I pulled the goggles back down, slowed up, opened the parachute, and landed. But because I was missing a contact lens and didn't know it, I rounded out, that is, I stopped my downward motion, as you can sort of flare a parachute. And I did that too high, dropped onto the ground from a great height, aggravated a knee injury that I got playing badminton. So then I was packing up my parachute for the third jump of the day, one eye said to me, you know, well, you have a bad knee, a bad elbow, and a bad eye. Go home. I took my own advice and went home. So that was my physical adventure, my unbelievable adventure. I thought my mother had taught me everything about this that I would ever have to know. But would you believe they have at Johnson Space Center what is called a potty trainer? The potty trainer is necessary because in weightlessness, of course, gravity doesn't move things in the desired direction. So you have to use a wind. And also the hole is only about 3 inches across, very small, so that a certain precision is required. And the potty trainer, besides learning all the levers and buttons and so on, is primarily for target practice. You have to learn how to aim. I found it hard to believe it. Do you think there's a light shining out of that tunnel? There is. It's called the ring light, would you believe? And in the center of the ring light is a television camera. And I couldn't believe it. We had a television camera in our toilet because we were not members of the British royal family. And in front of the astronaut is a television screen. And of course, the exercise is you move around on the toilet while admiring your rear end of the screen until you see that you are centrally aimed. And then you remember what it feels like so that you make it feel like that during the space flight so that you are properly aimed and you don't miss during the flight. So that was the unbelievable adventure. I'll show you a picture of the television screen, but I thought it would be sufficient to show you my hand on the screen. That's my hand. And I guess that's trying to describe the size of the Big Bang. We'll try to answer questions, but I guess we'll do that after Charlie has given his presentation. Thank you.
And I have the unfortunate challenge to follow that. What I'm going to follow with is kind of a more business-like presentation. So the only thing I can perhaps say that will segue into my presentation from Ken's is that given the fact that I have had the good fortune to practice some of the things that Ken trained at, I can tell you, Ken, that with all due humble modesty, that all the training you went through on the ground to calibrate your other end ain't nothing compared to the first lesson without gravity to help you unload. My time with you this morning is going to be spent telling you about our National Space Society and where we find ourselves on that road to space as an organization. And let me begin by reflecting that our road to space began with a conference 20 years ago in Princeton, New Jersey, at Princeton University. The 9th to 10th of May, 1974, that conference was opened by Dr. Gerard O'Neill with the words, "This meeting has been convened by individuals interested in exploring the possibilities of space colonization, the construction of habitats in space which could be richly productive and delightful to live in. The time scale is not the distant future, but now, using the science and engineering of the 1970s. I believe the technical imperatives of these new ideas are such as to encourage self-sufficiency, small governmental units, and a high degree of independence.
I was there.
It was 1 year ago, 1 year later, in Tucson, Arizona, that the L5 Society was formally incorporated. And in the words of its founders, one of whom is with us at this conference, Pete Henson, quote, "The first large organization stimulated by O'Neill's vision has appeared." The unofficial goal, as many of us I think know, of the L5 Society was to disband in a mass membership meeting in a space colony. Well, that was 20 years ago. The technology of the 70s hasn't gotten us self-sufficient, self-sustaining colonies yet. In fact, the then promise of the 70s to give us a cheap, reliable, frequent access to space didn't even come through there. As a sideline, I would only add that that's not because we didn't have, in fact, that technology in the 70s. It's just because we didn't have the courage to use it as it could be utilized in that regard. The L5 Society initiated grassroots activism in the pursuit of this road to space. It included a chapter system, political action, including a phone tree, a telephone tree network of volunteers, and sloganeering to get the word out, to get people's attention, and to try to focus their vision. Sloganeering like, decentralize, get off the planet. The space establishment of the early 1970s, at the very same time, was seeking to stimulate public interest and commitment to a continuing U.S. national space program. Government and industry initiated a public membership institute in support of NASA in 1974. Werner von Braun, the first president of the National Space Institute, described the purpose of the NSI as, quote, "to generate broad public support for the many direct contributions our national space program can render," end quote. The mechanisms that the National Space Institute utilized were newsletters and then a magazine, high visibility conferences with celebrity participation, tours to space shuttle launches, something called dial-a-shuttle. If you couldn't see a space shuttle launch, if you couldn't be at mission control, phone in. Listen to the communications between mission control and the spacecraft. And also initiated by the National Space Institute was the Young Astronauts Education Program. Well, those two organizations, while starting down perhaps different lanes of the same road, in fact merged into the same lane, became one organization in 1987. And we have individuals with us at this conference who, in fact, were the fathers of that merger. Today, 18% of the National Space Society's membership were members of one or both of those organizations. To hear again, or maybe to hear just for the first time about those hopeful early years of our organization's plan on being at the L5 point with a space colony, and even at that point in time, you know, there was plenty of optimistic talk that everyone believed was in fact well-founded, that we would have that mass meeting in maybe just another 5 years from now, by the end of the 1990s. Well, you can hear more about just exactly what it was like to be there, what it was like to hear those visions, to see those visions. You can hear that tonight at the L5 O'Neill NSI reunion at 8:15. Don't miss it. That was then. This is now. Today, the National Space Society, our National Space Society, is in fact a family of organizations. Space Cause, Space Pact, and the Space Society. Our National Space Society is a not-for-profit, public membership, education, and advocacy organization. Only about 15% of the membership work in the space field, and 24% work for governments. The leadership of our Space Society is committed to creating the future that both of those premier organizations saw. In explaining ourselves to others in the member countries from which our membership is derived around this planet, we have restated that commitment, that future, that vision in soundbite form as a spacefaring civilization. But we are not satisfied with this short form of our vision. In fact, I want, and we want, the leadership of the organization want to find a better way to soundbite that vision. You've heard you all should be committed to getting the word out, expressing that vision, communicating that vision, making others come to that vision, so that we will have a bigger community, a larger community internationally, to lead humanity, in fact, off this planet. Well, we want to be able to better do that with a few words that in fact ring in people's ears. We want words that clearly, concisely, and powerfully tell the rest of this world where we want to go. What we need are 5 words that, when spoken to your mother, will make her say, "Oh, now I see. I want to go too." Help us all and get your ideas to the chairman of our National Space Society's Executive Committee. Alan Wasser is here. Catch him. Let him know what you think those words are. It's necessary. The organization performs a wide variety of actions to realize our vision and fulfill the mission, which we believe is to promote change in social, technical, economic, and political conditions to advance the day when people will live and work in space. That is how we describe our mission. The list of accomplishments is much larger than I can read you here, the list of accomplishments of our Space Society in this past year. But I do want to let you know of some of them, because I don't think as a body you've probably had access to a complete rendition of what it is that this organization has done this year. There's been a strategic retreat where the vision and mission statements were hammered out. There's been testimony before 2 committees of the United States Congress, delivered personally by the leadership of the National Space Society. Numerous briefings to congressional staff and members of both houses on the single-stage rocket technology demonstrator program. Telephone tree activations, email and bulletin board system alerts urging contacts with the White House or with the Congress of the United States. Media interviews, editorial board meetings, production and distribution of TV public service announcements, which, if you haven't seen them already, you can see them tonight at the NSI O'Neill L5 reunion. The first annual 5K and 1K fund runs in Washington, D.C., all for the benefit of space. The race for space. It was not only fun, but it got people's attention. Anything to get people's attention positively to the subject. Educational activities. It was not only United States, but Canadian, Australian, many European nations, educational organizations. professional advisory positions on U.S. national committees, on, and not the least of which is the continuing production and editing of Ad Astra, the National Space Society's, your Space Society's publication. And how are these activities funded, you might ask? Good question. I thought you might be interested in a little information there. By category, our National Space Society expended its $1.1 million budget, with the largest share going to provide Ad Astra to the membership. That was 32% of that budget. The close second was 22% to bring in new members, which we did to the extent of something like 5,000 new members last year. And to get back current members. Fundraising took another 8% of the budget. Education efforts amounted to 9%. Direct support of the chapters, 7%. The board of directors, governors, and advisors, another 2%. Promotional activities came out of 7% of the budget, and the remaining 8% covered policy work and administrative. Put another way, payroll, for example, for the Washington, D.C. staff was 26%. Postage amounted to 16% of the expenses. And income paid for all but 2% of the bills. A little bit of red ink, yes. But it's a lot less than we've had in some years past. And you've got to remember that we've all went through a very deep recession. And in fact, our Space Society is now coming out of that recession with not only an upswing in memberships, but an upswing in revenue. That means we can begin to grow in a number of directions. Not only new memberships, but further outreach. That's very positive. Of this income, 38% came from renewals, 20% from new members, and 36% from contributions, individual contributions, and a few corporate contributions. 2% of that income came from advertising and Ad Astra, 4% from the mailing list rental, and royalties and building services. Our NSS has gotten more fiscally responsible, more efficient in fundraising and membership raising. Most of the credit goes to an excellent staff in the Washington, D.C. office, led by Lori Garber. I ask you to let her know that you know this and that you appreciate this. Space Cause. Space Cause I list as the second member of our family of organizations. Space Cause is a not-for-profit registered legislative lobby organization, the only active public lobby in Washington, D.C. that has space as its sole interest. The only lobby in the capital of the United States of America that is there with your space interest in mind. And it's our organization. Space Cause is truly a grassroots lobby. Over 60%, almost 70% of its funds comes from individual contributions. Me, you, the rest of us, thousands of other individuals. It has created cooperative efforts with other space organizations, both public and industry. Space Cause has even developed a tight working relationship with the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers Union. Thanks to its successes in lobbying the U.S. Congress this last year for the International Space Station and for Delta Clipper, contributions to Space Cause's budget are growing at the rate of 25% a year. Space Cause had a significant role in obtaining full funding of Space Station in last year's U.S. budget battle. Space Cause was a key player in obtaining $40 million for the single-stage to orbit rocket technology demonstrator, the DCX. That's $5 million more than the President requested for the program in his budget request. This year, Space Cause's campaign for the same programs is much larger. Space Cause is also focusing its lobbying efforts on supporting these programs because they represent the most relevant and real manifestations of our vision and our mission. The space base where 17 nations will learn how to live and work in space, and the only flying demonstration of the vision and the technologies needed to get cheap really cheap, rocket-powered access to space. But they're not the only activities that space causes pushing. There's commercial space legislation, and there's the hardcore concepts such as space power stations and the review of the 1979 Moon Treaty. Space Cause is successful at activating the informed membership of our National Space Society and other allied organizations for legislative results. And in fact, today, you can help in that pursuit. You can help by going to the exhibit hall. The Space Cause table has sample letters, and you have the opportunity, the envelopes, the stationery, to write letters in support of space station, the Delta Clipper, of these other concepts that we see as absolutely necessary to taking a few big leaps down that road into space. Writing those letters, handing them over to Space Cause, and we, Space Cause, in Washington, D.C., will carry them to congressional offices in the U.S. Congress as votes approach, as the impact becomes maximum on those issues. So help us all out, help yourself out by taking a couple of minutes and writing those letters. I believe that Space Cause's education activation approach should be applied to the space societies outside the USA. The legislative process of democracies are supposed to work for their citizens. Let's make it so. If you have the desire to become active in encouraging parliamentary legislation, appropriations, or just debates that work for our vision, then go talk to Mark Hopkins. He wants to help you find a way to take that opportunity in hand. Space PAC is the third member of this family. Space PAC is a registered political action committee in the U.S. It's been at work for the popular interests of space exploration and development in every national election since 1982. It now works with, among other organizations, the 800,000-member Aerospace Workers Union, the IAM. A good sign of how good a working relationship that is that for the first time, IAM has transferred from their political action committee, their PAC, to our Space PAC, a $5,000 contribution in support of our efforts. That's significant, and that's hard to get them to do. The political activism that Space PAC enables for the pro-space movement in the States should and can also be replicated in other countries. Let's do it. Find out how. Contact Mark Hopkins. Our National Space Society's international membership is 25,000 individuals. We have gotten through this recession of the past 4 years, and we're on our way up. Almost 1,000 members of the NSS reside in 18 countries other than the U.S. The National Space Society has a number of standing and operating committees: policy, science and technical, strategic planning, international, others. I won't list them all. We need to get international membership on our committees. We don't have nearly enough. We can count all of the international members on our operating committees on one hand. That, to me, is sad. And it's not where we need to be in terms of an international organization representing you. If you would like to volunteer your time to some of these committee activities, please contact myself, Alan Wasser, Buzz Aldrin, Lori Garber, any of the other members or directors of the society that are here. And the chapters are there. The chapters are doing all right. The successors of the chapters of the L5 Society, in fact, many of them are chapters of the former L5 Society, are too numerous to name them all. But a sampling of their works, of their activities, goes like Space Week activities, regular meetings, conferences, public lectures by distinguished individuals, educational programs for museums, visits to congressional offices, on and on and on. There are 120 chapters internationally. Only 10 chapters are outside the United States. That needs to be changed. That needs to be increased. If the chapter system continues, it's a must that those numbers increase and that they be truly active. Our NSS needs your help in adding members outside the United States, in adding chapters. I want to commend, in terms of the international chapters, the Canadian Space Agency for its leadership and its efforts in organizing this, the first International Space Development Conference outside the United States. I also want to commend the National Space Society of Australia for its outstanding leadership in the international community for our National Space Society. They've taken significant steps forward in developing an innovative reduced membership fee program, and in doing so have not only brought in increased revenues to their organization in Australia, the National Space Society headquarters in the States, but they've also increased membership from 67 to 273. That's significant. The chapter's assembly and the NSS board of directors need to work on a full set of chapters issues confronting that system internationally, and they need to take action on these matters because this is a vital element of this community of ours, of this family of organizations. Well, where do we go from here? Well, needless to say, we go that way. But the universe out there is full of tasks, full of things to be done that await our attention and our resources. This is more than even we can imagine, much less tackle with the limited resources that we have. So we must be careful in how we spend our time, how we spend our resources. I see our space society needing to address some internal issues now, like the space movement is not as cohesive a movement as it was 12 years ago. Differences in direction, differences in emphasis, and even objective are working to divide us. This division must not happen. Our space society has to continue the strategic planning process that we have begun internally. We have to walk down the road that is this process because the journey is at least as important as the changes that the process of review will manifest. The board and the executive committee must continue with this. We must, as an organization, decide what changes, if any, must be made to the general direction, form, and format of our second greatest organizational resource, Ad Astra, our publication. This deliberation and decision-making has to be continued in a reasonable debate format. It needs to happen with input and agreement of all the leadership. Ad Astra is too important a resource to impulsively change, but a magazine is not serving our vision or our mission if it is not on course. We have to determine that, adjust the course as necessary. Communications need to be improved. The phone tree system that was put in place, developed, matured by the L5 Society is now in tatters. That must be reinstated in some form. We need to look hard at both the need, the requirements, and how it's done. In this age of increasingly wired communications, perhaps we can do much more effectively with a combination of phones and electronic mail. We must determine what the right mix is, and we must put it in place. I just referred to our principal publication as our second greatest resource. What do you think our first is? People. Absolutely right. People are our first resource, our most valuable resource. Our space society is not utilizing this tremendous resource as effectively as we can. One specific problem I see is our executives. Our National Space Society has 6 vice presidents. none with responsibilities that are truly useful or well-defined for use within our society. This needs to change. If elected, these individuals must serve, not sit. Another point with regard to people, most of our Space Society's leadership is about 20 years older than they were 20 years ago. I've got to tell you for a fact, though, I think some of us have aged more than that in the last 20 years. The average age of our membership has also been rising. The NSS, our National Space Society, needs youth. It needs fresh ideas, it needs new energy, and it needs insight into the perspectives of the next generation. Let's set our recruitment sights farther down the age ladder. X marks the spot. The 1979 Moon Treaty is up for international review by the United Nations General Assembly. We have very specific feelings about the treaty today, just as we did when the L5 Society convinced the United States of America not to ratify the treaty. But the world situation has changed and it would be useful to do something constructive with the treaty. Our Space Society is looking at just how to do that. But this time we may want to remove the blanket language restricting private claims and the placement of language and in placing language and a process that's friendly to private property rights with unilateral international action to create a claims registry. Stay tuned on this one. This is important to the future of not only our vision, but this road. Finally, I want to say that this Space Society in the USA presses NASA to let our teacher go. What I'm talking about is that since the Teacher in Space program was suspended in 1986 with the death of Krista McCullough, NASA administrators in the States have played games with this program. Last month, Dan Golden admitted to 15,000 teachers that he was holding the program back indefinitely because, according to him, if a teacher flies, then everyone else, singers, poets, everyone will be clamoring for a seat on the space shuttle. So what? That's exactly what should happen. Our Space Society wants to see, is saying that it needs to see, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration step up to the future. In our lives, in every one of our lives, who has had the most impact on us? Teachers. I dare say that in some cases, teachers have had more impact on individuals than maybe even our families at home. But there is, in one perspective, of course, the fact that our families at home, our mothers, our fathers, our relatives, are teachers themselves. That's how you reach the next generation. That's how you express vision, confidence in the future, and opportunity. And if a teacher can't reach for the stars, then how the hell do we expect to be able to see through the mist and the haze and the negativism ourselves? The Teacher in Space program needs to happen soon. It needs to bring back to all of us, young and old, the experience, the optimism, the credibility of the future. And I think that needs to happen as soon as possible, only to be followed by, yes, the singer, the poet. Every walk of life should be represented early in the exploration and the development of space, because that's how we become connected. That's how we see farther down the road. That's how we find our way down the road. That's what I see in your National Space Society today. If you're not a member, join. If you are a member, act up. Thank you very much for your time.